I'm just going to have you say and spell your name and give us your updated many titles that you have.
Todd J. Hollis, with Todd J. Hollis Law. I'm a civil rights and personal injury attorney.
All right. And a little bit of your background in terms of civil rights before we start talking about it.
Well, I've had several high profile civil rights cases here in the city of Pittsburgh, and some that we're still presently working on now. Um, so.
Okay. And your initial reaction whenever you heard of the grand jury ruling in the Breonna Taylor case yesterday?
Horrifying. Um, Unfortunately, this has become the norm. Um, I think my biggest problem is that the justice system does not seem to afford justice to African American citizens.
If you were the attorney general in Kentucky, how would you charge the officers responsible for Taylor's death?
Well, if I'm being objective, I don't know that you could charge the officers with specific intent. From what I understand, that there was a shot fired from the alleged boyfriend. One of the officers was hit. That would justify the use of force. Um, there's some question as to whether the police followed protocol and whether they knocked and announced as they were supposed to. Um, but if there was an action that was taken by a third party that placed the police in danger, then they would obviously be justified in the use of force. Um, there seems to be some administrative issues that are also in play that question why the police were there, to what extent they followed protocols of the order. I understand that initially it wasn't supposed to be a knock and announce, and then at some point it was later changed to a knock and announce. The neighbors who were in the building heard the police say, police, but there was no knocking. Um, it's just a very troubling case, and unfortunately, Ms. Taylor, is the victim of it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of contention right now over that very point with did the officers announce themselves or did they not? And it seems that there's some sort of spotty witness testimony in the case where some say they did hear the officers announce themselves, others say I did not hear it. So, how do you properly vet these witnesses?
Well, witness testimony at times tends to be a bit unreliable. I always say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a video is worth 1,000,000. And you would have a video, but for the fact that the police officers were not wearing the body cams, which is questionable. They obviously knew that this was going to be an encounter where body cam information might be important, and they either chose not to wear those body cams, or they removed them just prior to making entry into that home. Both manners are troubling, because had they had those cameras on, we wouldn't have to ask those questions.
And you also brought up the point of shooting in self-defense, and I think that brings up the Castle Doctrine. What is the Castle Doctrine, and who does that apply to? Is that exclusive to Kentucky, or do we have that in Pennsylvania?
When you say I'm not familiar with the Castle Doctrine.
Okay, so that is apparently, I think, a law that's exclusive in Kentucky that sort of maps out, it sort of gives the blueprint of how self-defense works in terms of shooting and who it applies. People are questioning who does that apply to, because you can say that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend he fired that shot in self-defense. But I believe that they're applying this to the police, saying there were shots fired, and so they were also shooting in self-defense.
Well, police officers have what's called qualified immunity, and that allows them to use an appropriate measure of force when they believe that their lives are in danger. And the police will most often be given qualified immunity unless there's clear evidence that would show that they were reacting um, as an unreasonable police officer would. So that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and I think that's another issue that we're going to have to correct as a society if we want to um, at least be able to define how these incidents should be evaluated, because every jurisdiction is evaluating them differently. Um, Here in the Third Circuit, there would have to be existing case law that would determine whether this officer should know that his actions would potentially violate someone's civil rights. Does that change in another circuit? It certainly does. So therefore, you don't have a uniform application of the law. And you have situations like this where injustices happen, and the police officers can readily claim, and they often do, that they didn't know.
Right. I want to talk about the one charge, the wanton endangerment charge. What is that charge? Does it make sense for this case?
Well, it makes sense. Does that mean that the officers should not have been charged with criminal negligence? I believe they should have been. Wanton recklessness is very similar to what we have here, which is recklessly endangering another person, and that means that you used some measure of force where you potentially place someone else in danger of life and bodily harm without reasonableness. So from what I understand, a police officer was standing outside the window of someone else's apartment, and he was firing shots into basically a closed apartment without seeing, who was in there and if that person was presenting a threat to him. So that would justify that charge. I don't know that the Attorney General's evaluation of this would preclude the police officers from being charged with criminal negligence, because I believe that they should have been. But again, I'm not there, so I can't speak in specificity.
Right. But bringing it back to one of our first questions in terms of what charges do you think would be appropriate?
Homicide. Homicide. There's a form of criminal negligence. I don't know that Kentucky has criminal homicide. I know we do here in Pennsylvania. It's called manslaughter. So if someone kills somebody in some reckless or negligent fashion, in other words, without intent, then criminal manslaughter would be the appropriate charge.
And just watching the reaction nationally, also here in our city, over Breonna Taylor's death, first of all summer long, we've been hearing her name at protests and people calling for justice. And so now whenever this ruling comes out, it really just fueled people's anger, saying, this is not enough. So I suppose, is the response that we're seeing warranted? What needs to happen next? Because for a lot of people, this doesn't mean justice at all.
Well, I don't know that this is the end all. I mean, there's the federal investigation. They tend to take longer. So there is a possibility that the feds could possibly indict the police officers involved. Is it enough? I can't really answer that question. I certainly don't believe that justice was served. Again, I don't know all of the facts. I wasn't a part of the grand jury, so I don't know what information was presented to them. I'm sure that there's a lot of moving parts. I'm sure politics are at play. I'm sure that the Attorney General, for whatever reason, wants to make sure that he's presenting information that could possibly be responsible. But I don't know that.
Do you think it has anything to do with? Is it a racial issue?
Is what a racial issue?
Is this Breonna Taylor's death not being, for some people, select group of people, not being properly charged, the officers not being properly charged, does it have anything to do with race? The Attorney General is a black man.
Mm-hmm.
Is he being soft? You know,
That's not a question, unfortunately, that I can answer.
yeah.
I think that it has, it has a lot of components that would lead one to believe that race was involved, but I can't say to what factor. I would hope that the Attorney General is colorblind to these issues. Um, but again, it seems to happen more often than not to Black Americans. You know, particularly Black Americans that don't have the means to fight back.
And any, I guess, with this federal investigation, should that be a sign of hope for people? Should people be hoping that something good comes out of that for them, or whatever they perceive as justice for Breonna Taylor?
I'm not a big fan of hope. I'm a bigger fan of action. I believe that the Attorney General, along with the mayor, along with the chief of police, along with the city council in Kentucky, I believe that all of those people are, with the exception of the chief, they're all elected officials. To the extent that we don't believe that these people are serving the interests of the public, then they should show up on election day, and they should vote their position. And I don't want my comments to be characterized as somehow being some kind of dig against the police. The police officers have very tough jobs, and we appreciate their service. But there's something bigger going on, in this situation. This was a potential drug arrest, and the police officers knew that there was a potential for interaction with Miss Taylor and or other involved parties. Why didn't they have their body cams on? The police officers have sergeants, they have reviewing officers. Why didn't they ensure that those police officers were wearing body cams? And this, again, goes to another point that I think a lot of people are ignoring, is that when the police have to police themselves, there is a different standard of justice. Police officers will not tell on other police officers, even when they know that they are committing harm to our civilians. And to that extent, the culture must change, because police officers who see wrongdoing and don't report it are just as bad as the police officers who have committed that wrongdoing. But they're afraid to step out and to report it because they feel that their lives will be in danger. And many police officers have told me that. I mean, albeit confidentially, but they have told me that. So you're never going to correct this problem until you correct the culture.
And do you think that the body cams will be a first step in that direction, because the camera is always objective?
Well, the camera is definitely objective, but if you're not wearing the camera, what good is it? If you're not being enforced to wear the camera, then what good is it? If you can park your police vehicle in a direction not facing the incident, then the camera, is useless. So, in that instance, you haven't really made any significant progress towards change.
Anything else that you think is really important to add to this topic? It seems like, even for you, a seasoned civil rights attorney, that this is challenging.
I think we need a common evaluation from city to city, state to state, where there is one common standard for determining what excessive force means, one qualified standard for determining when police officers are entitled to use excessive force, one common standard for determining when police officers are not entitled to qualified immunity. The police cannot evaluate themselves. At least I don't believe that they can do so objectively. I believe that there needs to be, an individual separate body, free of collusion, that can come in and evaluate these things, because it's going to lead to these kind of results when individual governments are left to themselves to make a determination as to whether they are to be charged or not to be charged. And in this situation, I don't believe it took 18 months to come to a conclusion that these police officers violated this person's civil rights. These investigations take far too long, and it seems to me that they're almost positioning how they respond to the public's criticism before they've even made their determinations public. It just seems to me that they've already, kind of made up their minds as to how, they're going to play it. They're just looking for a way to present it to the public. And investigations are supposed to be objective. The facts are supposed to lead one to that conclusion. You don't kind of make up your mind and then kind of go back and determine what the facts are. I mean, it's disheartening. So my condolences go out to the Taylor family, and I hope that going forward, these things can change.
Are there enough facts? Is there enough evidence in this?
It's interesting that you asked that question. So the young man that was responsible or allegedly responsible for shooting the two police officers, apparently there were enough facts to arrest him, right? So he gets arrested immediately. However, the police officers that fired into her home, into her apartment, that investigation takes 8, 9, 10 months. They get placed on administrative leave. Why is there a disparity between how we investigate the police versus how we investigate individual citizens? The young man that shot those police, and I mean, if he did it, he was obviously wrong for doing so, but he gets arrested immediately. But yet the police officers, they apparently have a much, different understanding when it comes to the evaluation of their actions.
Does the FBI have better resources for investigating? Why are people putting a lot of faith in that? Because a lot of people are talking about that right now. Why do we need that federal investigation? What are they going to bring different to the table?
I don't think they can bring anything different to the table. I know that the laws are different as it relates to crimes that are allegedly federal as opposed to state. I mean, the laws are very different. I would imagine that maybe some of the tools that they're using, the way that the resources that they have could also be different. But it's also very hard for me to believe that the state wouldn't have access to that same information. I know there are a task force that the government, the federal government uses, the civil rights, litigation team will come in. And to the extent that the states need to use those various federal tools to assist them in their investigations, I don't understand why they can't bring those tools to bear and come to a conclusion within a reasonable period of time. It just never made sense to me that an investigation would take that long.
My last question is, what about the other officers who were there on scene? Why aren't we seeing anything in regards to them and some sort of legal consequence? Why just this one officer?
What do you mean when you say?
Well, so because there were obviously other people there. To my understanding, were there not multiple officers who fired? shots that day. So this one officer who's facing this wanton endangerment charge, is it just because he shot the fatal bullet?
My understanding is that that police officer that shot into the apartment didn't hit anyone. But the fact that he fired into an apartment without without being fired upon means that he did not have justification to use deadly force, particularly when he couldn't see where the shots were coming from. Like, he wasn't being fired upon. My guess is that he just simply responded to shots being fired, and so training comes into play. So to what extent would a well-trained police officer, respond when he knows that his colleagues are being fired upon? Would that give him reason to kind of join in the fray? I don't know. I can't answer that question, but um, it's very disheartening. The whole factual scenario is very disheartening, and I don't see any significant change in the coming years, because there's no common understanding. What we do here in Pennsylvania could be ruled constitutional, but what happens in Louisville, New York, or any other major city could be very different, and that's the problem that we're having.
Anything else that you want to add?
I got a question.
Yeah.
With and the frustrating thing with me, and I think people take to the streets so quick, and you can look at them when that the grand jury comes out, but we don't get to hear their evidence presented to them. Why can't they, as soon as they make that decision, don't you think it would quell a lot of problems if people could see what the grand jury sees?
Not just the grand jury, but complete transparency. When officers are involved in shootings, particularly this last one that took place in Wilkinsburg, for an unreasonable period of time, that police officer's name was not released to the public. Why not? If a grand jury is being impaneled to make a determination as to whether charges should or should not be charged, why would that not be a public, transparent process? Because if you're not asking the grand jury the appropriate questions upon which they can make a well-reasoned decision, then you don't know why the grand jury decided that they should or should not proceed. So, that process also, I believe, needs to be changed. Everything needs to be transparent. Honestly, these are public servants, and they don't have an expectation of privacy. So, to the extent that there's an investigation done, that investigation should be transparent.
How do you challenge that? Who do you go to and say, we want access to this? Is this something that happened? Do you needs to happen legislatively, or how would you do that?
It is legislative because the law allows it to be. But these laws are antiquated. I believe when many of them were created, we didn't have necessarily the problems that we're having now. But the biggest issue is trusting the police. And we don't believe that we can trust the police based upon what we see. There was a time when I first started practicing law when, somebody would come to court and they'd be charged with aggravated assault against a police officer. And more often than not, they would say to us, well, the police officer beat us up and then they charged us. And we really didn't have any information to dispute that. We were forced to go with whatever the police officer said. But that's different now. Now, when a client comes in, they say, listen, I have video, right? I don't need to necessarily ask you what took place. I can see it. And even then, with the video, a lot of these officers are being excused of their conduct because of antiquated laws, a misunderstanding of what qualified immunity is. This is just horrendous.
I got one more question. What do you think about
Oh, that's a recipe for disaster. A no-knock warrant is a recipe for disaster because you're putting too much control in the hands of a police officer when it comes to a potentially dangerous situation. So you come to someone's house and that person is in a relaxed state. The home is considered to be, a protected environment for you. And then out of nowhere, out of the blue, your door is broken into. Um, the natural thought, would be to protect yourself, right? So you've got a police officer with a gun, and potentially you've got, an armed citizen who's entitled to use, whatever force is reasonable to protect themselves. And you've got a potential explosive situation where, that citizen has no idea that the person at their door who's just breached their door, is a police officer. And, the reasonable thing, might be for that person to protect themselves. And then the police are going to say, well, we're protecting ourselves because you fired on us. So we fired back in self-defense. And, you get the situation that you got here. You got a young lady who had a very promising life who's dead. And money can never replace, a life. $12 million, I'm sure the family would prefer to have Miss Taylor as opposed to the money.